It's This Week in Creationism, episode number 62. I'm your host, Joel Duff, and here we take a look at the recent headlines in the world of young Earth creationism. This week we have clay problem rivals heat problem, a T-Rex fossil issue, and I want to talk a little bit about the new creation blog. We've got all that and much more coming on up. All right, so here we go. Let's start out with the new creation blog, which has a new look. Starting the new year, I opened up the website and it says new creation, and they have this new logo that's this blue whale. Prior to this, it said the new creation blog, and it was sponsored by Is Genesis History. Now that's been removed, and the blog seems to have been taken on a little more independent flair. Now remember, Is Genesis History was a big documentary from a few years back that made a big splash in the world of young Earth creationism. And at the time, those who had participated in that documentary, it kind of spun off into a whole bunch of, educational videos. And then one of the things that spun off from there was this blog. And this blog was set up to sort of help a new generation of young Earth creationists sort of get a start. And so there was a number of different students who were taking other young Earth creationist material and then writing sort of a lay level, sort of easy to approach understanding of sort of the young Earth scientific literature, the deeper literature. And I've said many times on This Week in Creationism and other places that these are some of the best articles in young Earth creationism. They're the best way to introduce yourself to young Earth creationism and to know sort of what's going on there. And so now with this, I guess, becoming a little more independent, it's still the same group of individuals for the most part that are going to be writing for the new creation blog. And they are what I have labeled the new creationist. If you've seen just a couple years ago, I did a whole series on what I said was what I would call the new creationist, a new sort of variety of young Earth creationism that's out there. And that's kind of become a little more stark, a little more obvious within the world of young Earth creationism over the past year because of Answers in Genesis. Answers in Genesis doing a multi-part series called The Young Earth Evolutionists, or Young Earth Evolution, in which they call out a bunch of people within their own ranks, within the ranks of young Earth creationism, for becoming too closely associated with evolution. Now, that's not necessarily the case for all these individuals on this particular blog, but there are many individuals associated with this particular blog that have been labeled as these problematic people within young Earth creationism, at least from the perspective of Answers in Genesis, but they're a dominant force within the world of young Earth creationism. So I've always appreciated the new approach, which to me is not just a new way of understanding the science, but it's a new way of interacting with science and a new approach to the apologetics of sort of preaching, teaching, and understanding young Earth creationism. Not enough time here. This Week in Creationism isn't for a deep probing of these different things. I just wanted to give you a little backdrop before I introduce a couple articles from the new creation blog, some things that they've been recently doing. All right, so it's a new branding for them. Oh, and they also have added a new YouTube channel that has videos that are going to be associated with this particular blog. All right, so, oh yeah, one other thing before we continue, sort of as the background for new creation blog. Their new logo, a whale, I think does accurately sort of present the emphasis that the new creation blog takes, which is they're very clear that they're really focused on creation science and the challenges that are posed to creation science. They have an interest in biology and geology, and that kind of fits with this whale theme, since there's a big questions about whales in the fossil record, and there's also questions about the origins of whales. And you can see just from this description here, they go on and talk about like why the whale. They're talking about the amazing, the fact that whales are an amazing creation of God. So you can see like what they've written in here, turning to the fossil record, not only are there amazing living whales, but there's also a variety of fossil whales, and the fossil whales are quite different, right? Some of them have tiny back legs, right? And mouths full of teeth and so forth. So they raise this like fundamental question, something that they're interested in trying to answer. Did all these species diversify from one created kind? Right? That's the big question, right, in young Earth creation. One of the big questions in young Earth creation is what exactly is a kind, and how does one distinguish one kind from another? Or are they multiple created kinds? And then how does the whale fossil record fit into our broader understanding of young Earth history? That's something that relates to a recent video I did on how the fact that cetaceans, whales, dolphins, and porpoises, their fossils are only found in the very upper layer of the fossil record that many young Earth creationists believe is a post-flood event. So where did the whales come from? So these are challenging questions for young Earth creationists, and they're acknowledging that these are questions that they need to have answers for, and that's one of the things that they hope to probe and do on this particular blog. And then they go on to describe some of the interesting questions that young Earth biologists, need to explore. And several, actually, I'd say multiple individuals that are going to be involved in this blog are interested in biology. So what are some of those questions? How many created kinds did God create? What processes cause them to diversify into so many varied forms? What are the biological mechanisms of changes in organisms? How did the fall of Adam and Eve change or affect the biological world? That's something that I've been interested in discussing and exploring, and have a different viewpoint from young Earth creationists on this. Are there any fossils of whales from the flood itself, or all the fossil whales from after the flood? I just mentioned that, right? That is a really big question for young Earth creationists. Okay, but on to an article that was recently published on the New Creation that has to do with something that I've been just really excited to tell you about and wanting to talk about for, probably a year now, and certainly within the last few months. But an article has been published in the young Earth creationist literature, which I think is going to be it's a seminal moment, right? At least for me, I think is going to become a very important paper that many of us will be talking about for many years. And that paper, which I'll show you in a moment, was recently reviewed and discussed on the New Creation blog. It's the first place I've seen that has responded to it. And they responded to it in this article titled Mystery of the Flood Mud Rocks. Mystery of the Flood Mud Rocks. And here's the paper. It's in the Creation Research Society Quarterly, CRSQ, and it's not easy to get because it's behind a paywall. So I have a copy of this here from Scott Dunn himself. And I knew this paper was coming out because I knew Scott had told me about this paper, and I knew about the origins of this paper. And so the title, The Clay Consolidation Problem and Its Implications for Flood Geology Models. Have you heard of the heat problem, right? The heat problem many people talk about is a significant challenge to young Earth creationists and young Earth flood geology models in particular. The heat problem is all the different layers of volcanic rocks that are in the flood layers. And then so that's a considerable amount of heat that would have been produced in order to produce all that volcanic rock. And if it's all being made in just a space of a few months or less than a year, it's an enormous amount of heat production. And then when you include all the continents moving around and sliding against each other, the amount of friction would have melted, a good portion of the rock record itself rather than allowing it to consolidate. And then there's a number of other sources of heat from various chemical reactions that all would have been, natural outcomes of any kind of chaotic global catastrophe that created the entire geological column within a period of a year. And so without the addition of miracles to remove the heat, removing the heat has been what's called the heat problem. Lots of other people have written about this and spoken about it, and lots of young Earth creationists have tried to take up the challenge of explaining the heat problem, but it remains a big problem. Now, what I'm going to say is that I think the clay consolidation problem, or the dewatering problem, or we'll come up with a snazzy name for this eventually, is as big of a problem. Maybe not as, yes, it is. It's a very serious problem for young Earth creationist flood models. And it's laid out in this particular article on CRCS. If it's such a big problem, why is it in this young Earth creationist journal? Well, that's because kudos to them. they took a paper submitted to them that was very critical of flood geology models, saying that the flood geology models so far has not solved the problem. So they present it as a challenge to flood geology, and they published it in their journal. And so I'm going to talk about that later because I want to review this paper in more depth, make a whole video just devoted to this one paper. So I will talk about my thoughts on, the young Earth creationist community and their response and why they've published this particular paper. I'll do that then. I'll just tell you that if you want to get a glimpse, since this thing is behind a paywall, if you want to know what that paper is about, go to the New Creation blog right here, Mystery of Flood Rocks, and read Christian Ryan's summary of that response to it. It's not a response as like, here's the answer. Christian Ryan is really saying, here's a layman's overview of sort of what's a lot of math in that particular paper, of what the challenge is, what the problem is for flood geology. And Christian Ryan's going to say in the end, you're right. Young Earth creationists don't have a solution for this. It looks like a significant challenge for flood geology models that they need to work on. And I'm just going to read a few little excerpts from this New Creation blog piece. New Creation, the blog, exists to propagate the real work of creation scientists using a Genesis paradigm to develop testable scientific hypotheses and construct models. All right, I'm reading this because this is a nice description of what they perceive themselves as doing with this blog. We believe this approach could provide the best overall explanation of scientific data, but in doing so, we also need to acknowledge parts of our models that remain incomplete. Unsolved mysteries are wound into the very fiber of the scientific process. This is literally why we do science. This is the one thing I love about the folks at the New Creation blog versus like Answers in Genesis is they have true curiosity. They have real curiosity about the world. They recognize problems and they're interested in doing science. They're interested in problem solving. And you can argue and say that it's impossible for them to find answers within this particular framework of young Earth creationism. But they are truly intrigued and interested in understanding the world around us using scientific processes and understandings. So unknowns should neither scare nor discourage us. They should excite us and motivate us. Unknowns are an integral part of the scientific process. They challenge our research and push us closer in the right direction. All right, so that's his introduction to what's going to be a challenge, right? I say like, now what I'm going to tell you is something for which I don't have an answer for. But we as creation scientists, in their minds, we shouldn't be scared of this. These are observations from God's real world out there, and we need to have some way to explain what's going on. How do we solve the mystery of the flood rocks? This is way down the paper. He actually is quite an extensive discussion, or really overview of Scott Dunn's paper. And then he gets down to the end. It's like, okay, all right, here, I've laid it out. What are we supposed to do about this? The discussion above presents a puzzling conundrum. On the one hand, scientists today have lab and field experience based knowledge on the dewatering rates of different types of sediment, including clays and silts. Okay, what is the dewatering problem or the clay problem or the clay consolidation problem? It's that if you had a global flood that laid down hundreds or thousands of feet of sediment that eventually becomes clay stones, right? Shales and so forth. That requires that the mud that was laid down, that was full of water, the water had to be squeezed out of that rock, right? Or squeezed out of that sediment prior to the lithification process, which then turns it into stone. And scientists have found, through many studies, that dewatering time period takes a long time. Right? There's no quick and easy way to squeeze water out of mud in order to make it into clay. That's at its root the problem. Because young Earth creationists don't have a lot of time. They need all that rock made in a very short period of time, not hundreds of thousands of years. All right, let me continue on because Christian Ryan's going to explain it so much better than I can. We only know that dewatering of clays and silts occurs slowly over a long period of time due to the very low permeabilities of these materials. He's saying up front, we know that dewatering of clays occurs slowly. There's enough physical evidence, of this experimental evidence, to know that mud doesn't simply, have water removed from it, even under compaction, right? Even if there's multiple amounts of stuff on top, for one thing, the water has to go through that material as well in order to escape. On the other hand, creation scientists know from Scripture that these time frames are much too long, right? Saying we believe the Scriptures, our interpretation of Scriptures is that there's only so much, there's only a couple thousand years, right? And so this dewatering process is too long. He's acknowledging it. It doesn't appear like there is nearly enough time to dewater the mud in order to make the rocks that we see in the fossil record in our short time frame. From other field observations, such as footprints, there's footprints in the fossil record, which means the dewatering had to have occurred at enough dewatering occurred in order to create consolidation for animals to walk on the surface to create footprints. That's what's a really fascinating part of that paper. Can't go into it right now. And the dewatering rate must have been much faster during the flood than we witness today. This would require us to identify a mechanism that speeds up the dewatering and hardening of mud by a factor of around 1 million. All right. How do we account for these inconsistencies? Right. I'll leave it there. Right? And Christian Ryan is leaving it there. On the New Creation blog, it's basically, we've got two things. They don't match up. Our observations and what we believe Scripture demands of the evidence. And how do we account for these inconsistencies? I throw it out to young earth creationists, especially young earth creationist geologists, need to get to work on this problem right now. Let's move on. Answers in Genesis damage control for young earth evolution articles? That's what I thought when I first started to read this particular article. Remember, I mentioned that Answers in Genesis has written a whole series of articles called Young Earth Evolution. It's like a series of 11 articles about the evils of young earth evolution, about how evolutionary thinking has been seeping into the world of young earth creationism, and they're calling it out. And by calling it out, I mean they're calling out individuals within young earth creationism and calling them basically compromisers. And so we get this article, and it comes to us, where do all the species come from? What is speciation, and do creationists think it happens? Right, and look who the author is. Our author is our friend Harry F. Sanders III. And Harry F. Sanders III is the author, or at least primary contributor, of multiple of those articles and Answers in Genesis that call out young earth evolution. So Harry F. Sanders is back writing for Answers in Genesis here with this article, which is really a retread of a whole bunch of other things he's written in other articles, just kind of put together in this article. So having read all of his articles, I recognize almost all the language in here. He's going to go on about the definition of species and a whole bunch of other things about Linnaeus and so forth. But eventually he gets down to this big question. All right, because here's the thing. They've gotten a lot of, Answers in Genesis gotten a lot of pushback after their series about young earth evolution. And a lot of that pushback is like, you know what? You're claiming that other young earth creationists have been falling for evolutionary propositions when you yourself apply many evolutionary explanations and seem to be under the influence of evolutionary theory yourself, right? In fact, some people have called Answers in Genesis views of speciation hyper-evolution. And so, of course, he has a title here, Do Creationists Believe in Hyper-Evolution? Some atheists and theistic evolutionists in academia have armed themselves with slightly more knowledge of what creationists believe and accuse creationists of believing in so-called hyper-evolution. Harry F. Sanders, I do appreciate the reference, because one of the references there is to me and one of my articles. Here it is. Descent with Modification, How Post-Creationists Claim of Hyper-Rapid Speciation, so I'm using that word or a similar word, hyper-rapid speciation, opposes yet embraces evolutionary theory, claiming that his view and Answers in Genesis view of the speciation process is embracing evolutionary theory, all right, the processes of evolutionary theory. It's hyper-rapid, right? So hyper-rapid processes, but nonetheless, claiming the same processes that evolutionary theory does. All right, if I can just go back here really quickly. Perhaps surprisingly, they claim creationists believe in evolution, just evolution that happens very quickly. Of course, this is just poorly researched as promulgated as a fixity of species claim. It assumes evolution means change over time, which creationists never rejected. All right, so he tries to throw this on like, well, of course we believe in change, right? Biblical creationists just don't believe that change has limits, though. And evolutionists don't believe that, as if like that's the only thing that defines what evolution is. It's like, oh, there's no limits. In other words, he's talking about common ancestry of all life, right? That to him is what the definition of evolution is. And then he tries to claim that this rapid speciation rate isn't as dire as people like myself say it is, right? They say the required rate of speciation since the flood is not nearly as dire as presented. If one new mammalian species arose every 200 years, most mammalian families would be easily accounted for. Only a handful would still need to be explained. I mean, what he's talking about there is he's saying like, oh, if every 200 years you had a new mammalian species within a family, so like the canines, you had two dogs walk off the ark, and then 200 years later you had two species, and then 200 years later you had two more species, and so forth. You would get up to, by the point you're here today, you would get up to like the 30 or 40 species that are in existence. Okay, yeah, that sounds kind of reasonable on the surface. The thing is, even looking in the Bible, we know that there was multiple different kinds of canines that were present very early on in the scriptures. And so the diversification would have happened very, very quickly. The fossil record, a bunch of other pieces of evidence suggest that most of the species we see today have been around during all biblical times, right? So it's not that we see that speciation continuing today at the same pace. He has to account for almost all speciation occurring within the first couple hundred years after the flood, if not even quicker than that. And then you get to the problems like you mentioned. Well, there's some things need to be explained. Well, yes, like there's 150 other species of canines that are in the fossil record, right? Post-flood fossil record. So two canines got off the ark and then became 150 different species that all went extinct within the last couple thousand years. And so that speciation rate is far higher than he's recognizing here and telling his audience. So is fast speciation the rule or the exception to the rule? This is the way I kind of quantified what he's talking about here. That's not his words. Those are my words. The irony is that evolutionists themselves have discussed observed extreme rapid formation of species. Yeah, sure, that's true. There are a few examples of rapid speciation. Within a few generations, we have seen some new species form. Species are extremely similar to each other and are derived under very unique conditions, which is why I say, is that kind of speciation the rule, the way things normally happen? Or is that an extreme exception to the rule being that it takes thousands and tens of thousands of generations to generate new species? It certainly is an exception to that rule. But Harry F. Sanders wants to point out one or two examples across the millions of species on Earth of new species that have formed within the last 100 years and say that, oh, well, then maybe all species could be forming within a few years. And then he ends that section, right, after saying like, oh, look, in the literature, there's a couple of examples of really fast speciation rates. And he ends that paragraph with this great line: perhaps the academics should read more academic papers. It's like, did they know about it? Don't they know about this? Don't they know about these examples? I am sure I know of 5 times more examples than Harry F. Sanders knows about. All right? I know of more examples. And I still know those are exceptions to the general rule. All right? So what about, and again, this is my wording up here. How were hundreds of species of elephants formed from 2 individuals on the ark? Right. I know you think it, but there's only 3 species of elephants. No, there's well over 100 in the fossil record, and they're all in the upper layers of the rock record, which are post-flood. So 2 elephants on the ark, those 2 become hundreds of types of elephants. Since they have lifespans that are quite long and they don't even reproduce until they're 15 to 25 years old, within 200 years after the flood, you only have a few elephants even alive, much less making many, many different species, which then have to be preserved in the fossil record somehow. And all of them have to have gone extinct like long before we really have any records, because we don't have any records of other elephants other than maybe mammoths and mastodons actually beating human beings. But they are just a couple of the many that were out there. So flood speciation. In a post-flood scenario, speciation likely occurred. I just want to give you another taste of what is going through the young earth creationist mind with respect to this rapid speciation thing. Speciation likely occurred in a relatively linear pattern. This he gets from Nathaniel Jeanson, which again doesn't work with respect to the actual biblical record of organisms that are mentioned in the Bible. And it certainly doesn't work with respect to the fossil record as it relates to post-flood geology. So that Jeanson stuff is all theoretical, not based on observations from the world around us in terms of the fossil record and scripture, most importantly. As animals spread from Ararat, new species would have emerged naturally as species moved away from each other and into varying habitats. The founder effect would have had significant impact on these new populations. Variable alleles would have been uncommon in these original small populations. Due to genetic drift associated with the founder effect, fixed traits would have appeared quickly in populations, making them differentiate relatively easily. I read all that because I wanted you to notice the wording in there. You've got founder effect, you have genetic drift, you have small populations, you have alleles, and not mentioned is natural selection, but that's what he means by moving into new environments. So they would have been challenged in those environments, and selection would have selected upon those particular traits. The only word missing here is mutation. That would be the only other thing you would add as like an ingredient that evolutionary biologists would say are the four major processes of that drive evolution, changes of organisms over time. So he's invoking all things that are part of evolutionary biology. They're evolutionary processes. And I've got another example of that at the end with a meme, which we'll hit at the very end of this episode. So he's arguing that within just a few generations, there's going to be different distinct species appearing. Down there at the end, rapid speciation is a process that's in perfect accord with the creation model. But maybe not the observed, but maybe not what is actually recorded in Scripture. In fact, it's exactly what creationists would expect if the Bible were true. No, that's not what I would expect. While there are specific details of processes are open to debate, the fact that it happened is indisputable, and it matches the biblical model perfectly. Perfectly? I mean, talk about using non-scientific language in your article in which you're trying to argue your science about speciation. Let's leave that there. The nonsense that is Harry F. Sanders' attempts to understand and explain evolutionary theory. T-Rex out of nowhere. Got Brian Thomas. I typically kind of ignore Brian Thomas. He just constantly misunderstands the literature, and he just reiterates the same kind of response to every single article he's ever seen. But there's a couple little things in here I wanted to point out. He's just talking about how, like, okay, there's lots of variation in T-Rex. Now the question is, and he's going to try to state that, like, in the fossil record, it appears like tyrannosaurids just sort of kind of appear as if they don't have any ancestry with any other dinosaurs. So he's trying to make an argument they're a kind, right? God created just Tyrannosaurus as, not Tyrannosaurus Rex, the Tyrannosaurids as a kind or a group of things with lots of variation, including things that are the size of a chicken all the way up to a T-Rex. All right, he's going to include being all in the same kind. So he's talking about how, like, yeah, there's all this talk about, these different types of tyrannosaurids, and they have all these different types of variations, right? They've been found in different places, all pretty much in the Cretaceous, by the way. So in a very thin section, very small portion of the totality of the fossil record is where you find the tyrannosaurids. This assumes a time tens of millions of years ago which required habits like rivers and shorelines supposedly deposited these fossils, despite the fact that natural processes virtually fail to fossilize vertebrates today. Okay, I gotta laugh out of this one because, despite the fact that natural processes virtually fail to fossilize vertebrates today. I'm sure that Brian Osborne believes that there are tens of millions, if not hundreds of millions, of vertebrate fossils that come from non-flood, non-global flood deposits, right? Now, Brian Thomas believes there's kind of like a higher limit to where the post-flood flood boundary is, and so not that much rock has been laid down after the flood. Nonetheless, that rock that was laid down after the flood contains millions and millions and millions of fossils, like the Green River Formation, right? There's plenty of vertebrates in there as well. So, and those were after the flood. So that sure seems like a natural process to me. All right, so I didn't really even talk about Tyrannosaurids. This article, when I just look at articles like this, I see him toss off lines like this, and it's like, do you know anything about the fossil record, and are you being at all consistent with your own beliefs, right? Especially answers in Genesis, right? We have thousands of fossils of extinct elephants, all right? They're all post-flood in the answers in Genesis model. They're all post-flood. They did not die as a result of a global flood and get buried quickly in a global flood. They got buried after the flood. So therefore, it's ridiculous to say that natural processes virtually fail to fossilize vertebrates today. No, they do fossilize vertebrates today. Sure, only one out of every 100,000 individuals of a population will eventually end up as a fossil. But since there are billions of individuals that have lived over thousands of years, or in the case of the conventional geology, over tens of millions of years, then lots of fossils are present and have been formed by natural processes, meaning in their case, not global flood processes. And then going on, he's still talking about dinosaurs, and it's like, oh, you know, God's word provides a clear history of Tyrannosaurs. God says he created them with their basic body plan right from the beginning. Along this line, the reason why Tyrannosaurs come in so many size variations, right, from 30 feet long to 9 feet long, could derive from the creator endowing the original parents with the potential to alter ornamentation traits. They could have had all these crazy features, different sizes, right, and so forth, eaten different, even maybe eaten slightly different kinds of foods and so forth, and there's different kinds in different parts of the world. But those are not fundamental trait differences. He always has to toss this in. They're not fundamental traits. I want to see a definition of that. What is a fundamental trait? Because what he's saying is fundamental traits, fundamentally different traits couldn't evolve. But if they're just variations on a theme, that can evolve, because that could be part of the variation that God created them at. That way they could sport head crests, have larger bodies or smaller bodies. They could fill the earth. Genesis creation fits what we see, despite the ridicule it suffers. I need a definition. What is a fundamental trait, and how have you defined that? How do you know a trait what the limits of that particular trait are, and what a new trait is? Tyrannosaurids come in a lot of different shapes and sizes, and they would have all had to have been alive all at one time before the flood. And there's not much time between creation and the flood. So that's, again, hyper-rapid speciation that they have to impose. Okay, wrapping it up. I've just got a couple memes, all right? And you know, I'm not a big meme fan. Don't like memes, don't like to share memes. And this is one of the reasons why, because it's hard to communicate in a meme accurately. It's especially hard to communicate accurately when you don't know what you're talking about. But Answers in Genesis has apparently gotten a new graphics designer, or decided on a sort of a new look. And they keep up with the times, right? They watch what the world is doing, and they like to mimic the rest of the world, what the rest of the world does. Right? And so they're making snazzier graphics lately. And so they have this new color scheme and all that. Let me just read a couple of these to you. Here we have a link to an article on the molecular clock. This first one over here. And then they pull out this quote. The creationist worldview, which rejects the concept of a common ancestor and evolutionary timescales, offers a coherent framework for understanding genetic variability and mutation rates, aligning with biblical principles of creation and divine design. That's kind of laughable to say that offers a coherent framework for understanding genetic variability and mutation rates, right? Because mutation rates are one of the hardest things for them to explain within the framework of how much variation there is within a kind, within the short amount of time they have. I don't think of the young Earth creationist model as being a coherent framework at all. The vast majority of articles the young Earth creationists publish are attempts to explain one particular problem. But that one problem often doesn't explain another. We just saw an example. I mean, Brian Thomas wants to say that the flood is what causes all fossils. You can't easily fossilize something outside of a global flood, which is really fast and saves things really, really quickly, buries them really quickly. Right. And so as a result, he then kind of forgets that in his own model, there's millions of fossils that were not formed during the global flood. But he's only thinking of one thing at the time he's writing that. He's thinking about tyrannosaurids and trying to explain them. And that's what happens. You get focused on explaining one thing, you come up with some ad hoc explanations, think like, great, I got an explanation for it. But those ad hoc explanations create another problem because they don't fit with another part of your theory, right? It's not coherent. That's the thing about scientific theories. The more coherent they are, it means they can explain multiple different forms of data. And when you find new things, they can be plugged into that theory easily, finding all kinds of observations all the time for which young Earth creationists have difficulty explaining. Again, Elizabeth Mitchell. And Elizabeth Mitchell hasn't been around for a long time, so these are actually old articles that they're resurrecting and pulling these quotes from. The biblical model provides a coherent explanation for the absence of certain fossils and the order of the burial in the geological column. Absolutely not. Right? That's just like, that's a nonsensical thing to say. There are extreme challenges that are brought to young Earth creationism due to the fact that from the observations of the fossil record. I just did a video on where marine reptiles are found versus where cetaceans are found. The biblical flood model does not provide a coherent explanation for the absence of cetaceans in the flood rocks. It does not provide a coherent model for explaining sea reptiles in only one portion of the fossil record. It does not provide a coherent model for the burial of diatoms and lots of other small unicellular organisms and the ordering we find those in. Right? Thousands of problems. It's clearly not a coherent model. It is a model that's looking for coherency. And like the New Creation blog would say, yes, that's it. There's inconsistencies there. We're here to work to try to figure those out and produce a coherent model. We don't have a coherent model yet. Just claiming you have a coherent model, not good enough. Here's Calvin Smith, CEO of Answers in Genesis in Canada. Trying to blend evolutionary processes with Christian theology presents a conundrum at a foundational level. It leaves the person obviously cherry-picking biblical passages with an inconsistent and unjustifiable hermeneutic. I'm just going to pick on a little language here from Calvin Smith. Trying to blend evolutionary processes with Christian theology presents a conundrum. What did I just read from Harry F. Sanders? Harry F. Sanders employed natural selection, genetic drift, and subsets of things from genetic drift like bottlenecks, small population size, alleles, variation in alleles, and so forth. All right. And what he did was he invoked evolutionary processes. Right? What young Earth creationist doesn't blend evolutionary processes with Christian theology? Well, okay, there's ICR. They try to deny natural selection. Answers in Genesis, they completely accept the fact that a process for adapting organisms to their environments is natural selection. That natural selection works. It functions. Right? It is an evolutionary process. When I talk about evolutionary processes in my class, I talk about 4 evolutionary processes, right? Do creationists deny any of those? Like I said, some of them do, but most of them accept all of those processes. And so they are taking evolutionary processes and they are blending them with Christian theology. Now, in the case of young Earth creationists and Harry F. Sanders, they're taking an evolutionary process like natural selection, and or genetic drift, and they're going to have to propose that it works at a faster pace than anyone's ever observed before. And was they actually have to modify some of those processes to sort of speed them up somehow. But nonetheless, they're taking the core part of the idea of those processes and they're applying them to a young world. Now, I'm sure what Calvin Smith really meant to say was, he would have, if he had this to say again, he'd say, trying to blend evolutionary theory with Christian theology. Except evolutionary theory is really about the processes. But nonetheless, he might have been able to like make that sound a little more palatable and not be so silly, because I mean, when you talk about the processes are the processes, right? And if you're not going to deny those processes aren't at work in nature, because even young earth creationists say that mutations happen, right? And they do have an effect on organisms, and they affect how organisms change, right? And so you're going to, and you have to deal with what that change means with respect to how we understand the world, right? So I don't know any Christian that's not blending evolutionary processes with Christian theology. They come to different conclusions. They have different ideas about how to do that. So Calvin Smith is blending evolutionary processes with Christian theology. And he doesn't apparently think it's a conundrum, even though he says it's a conundrum. That's it. That's it. That's all I got this week for This Week in Creationism. I'm working on a multi-part series on the idea of creation with the appearance of age, or mature creation. And so I've already put out there my first one, which is kind of a big summary of appearance of age. I call it the false hope of mature creation, and why even young earth creationists don't try not to appeal to appearance of age and mature creation. But I have a number of follow-ups to that. And so I'm thinking it's going to be at least 4 more videos in which I explore some of we're going to go a lot deeper into that. And I'm going to look at typical things that Christians say about apparent age, or typical arguments that they make, and things I've seen pastors say, and respond to those. So that's one thing that I'm working on a lot. Got a couple more flood geology failure episodes coming up. And then I'm also converting a couple old blog posts into videos. So a bunch of material coming out. And then, of course, another This Week in Creationism as soon as I collect enough interesting tidbits from this world in creationism. So with that, hey, thanks for listening. Appreciate you being here. We'll talk to you and see you later. Bye-bye.